So the grandmother character we were just alluding to is Rose. Rose Zimmer is her last name in the book. And her daughter is now named Miriam Gogan because she's married this Irish folk singer. And Miriam propelled herself out of Queens precisely by marrying into the, kind of lower orders of folk royalty in Greenwich Village. She was hanging out on MacDougal Street, and she graduated herself from Queens and became a Manhattanite by becoming part of the folk scene. And this is 1969. Now, Rose has partly filled this vacuum in her life by semi-adopting this black policeman's kid, who in this chapter in 1969 is 13 years old. And his name is Cicero Lookins. And, much as my grandmother dragged me around Sunnyside, Rose, the grandmother, has been dragging Cicero, this black kid, around Sunnyside and taking him to the library and educating him in her idea of culture. And this is a scene where Miriam decides to leap in. So the daughter is kind of grabbing hold of Cicero and saying, Rose is not the only thing out there. And I'm not going to get very far into the scene, but I'll read a little bit. When he was 13 years old, Cicero Lookins was told for the first and only time that Rose Zimmer had once shoved her daughter's head into an oven. Miriam Gogan told him this one cool November afternoon, a day unforgettable in any number of arresting specifics. It began with chess. Cicero had lately been savaging all comers at IS 125's chess club, so Miriam, on Rose's counsel, had proposed to bring him to call on Cousin Lenny at the chess store on MacDougal, there to play and have measured whether he might be a prodigy, a wunderkind. Afterwards, Miriam promised she'd shepherd Cicero to a loft on Grand Street to have his astrological chart professionally drawn for him. So this would be a day of futures foretold. Though thanks to Rose and Cicero's father's improbably durable affair, Rose is sleeping with the black cop whose son Cicero is, though thanks to Rose and Cicero's father's improbably durable affair, she might be considered Cicero's de facto older sister, Miriam had artfully ignored Cicero until sweeping him up this day. She'd come and seized him from Rose's apartment, from Rose's grip, and with very little ceremony in the exchange, as though it were graduation day. Miriam, in her flyaway hair and long houndstooth coat, hypnotic pattern of the black and white squares like some devilishly blurred chessboard, but one you couldn't play on, couldn't see in its entirety at once because it wrapped around her. Cicero should have known at that moment that Miriam was here to foster revolution in him, to demonstrate that the chessboard, like the world, wasn't flat but round. Cicero had been, to that point, Rose's Negro boy. So, Cicero supposed, Miriam planned now to put some check on that dynamic, to insert in Cicero's mind a little healthy skepticism as to Rose's high ideals. Cicero's obedient silences would have suggested the need for such intervention. Outwardly, he was obedient in the extreme. In point of fact, Cicero at 13 was already a monster of skepticism. Yet he believed in chess. Chess was a secret garden of rational absolutes. On the squares, things swooped or swerved according to their hard and fast scripts. Bishops and rooks thus, pawns durably plotting, black and white, unmistakable foes. Knights, like Cicero himself, had some secrets. They played at brazen invisibility, at walking through walls. Apparently looking in one direction, knights killed you in a side glance from another. If you employed them just so, all other pieces seemed earth-mired, sluggish as pawns. To that day, Cicero had been tempted to believe that if you got good enough at a first thing, you might never need to master a second. Cicero believed in chess, and so, though Miriam interested him as a fellow endurer of Rose, one with an advantage of years, when Miriam escorted Cicero into the tiny chess store, he forgot about both women. The store, air mucked with pipe smoke, smeared glass cabinets exhibiting exotic sets, and in the ice-cold mezzanine, the gray obsessive figures, barely human, their coats not even shed, hunched over gnarled endgames. the pale, twitchy hands that darted forth from sleeves to clop the wooden pieces forcefully to new squares and flicked out to punch the dull brass button on the time clocks. Those hands might have had a life of their own, no relation to the rolling eyes and bunching brows and pursing lips above. You might have no idea, looking only at the faces, which of them was connected to the hands that had made the moves. This might be Cicero's first glimpse, really, of an authentically academic setting, the destination towards which his life was pitched. A miniaturized world craven with self-regard, unimpressive except to those who read the palace codes, and sublimely oblivious to the outside. And Cicero was here not only to meet, at last, crazy cousin Lenny, who'd played Bobby Fischer once. He was here to play him. Lenin Anguish bustled upstairs a moment after. Cousin Lenny's given name is Lenin. Lenin Anguish bustled upstairs a moment after. "A glass of tea," he said before greeting Miriam, slapping his palm in mock outrage on the small counter where the proprietor only lifted his eyebrows slightly. Then the bearded fist of cousin Lenny's face unclenched, his smile revealing a trace relation to Rose in the gap of his teeth. "Boobala!" He clutched Miriam in her houndstooth coat, her purse trapped in his embrace, his limbs encasing her like a sausage. Then released her to the vigilance of his gaze, which mingled scorn, worship, and guilt. The black hair everywhere on his head was clipped to a weirdly identical length. His fuller brushes of eyebrows, his lip-smothering beard, the hair on the top the same as that shooting from around his ears, as though he'd been mowed. His spinal curvature tended towards the rabbinical, his eyes toward the heretic. That beneath his stinking black coat he wore some insignias of the hippie, a worn thin Woodstock t-shirt, bird perched on guitar's neck, a frayed woven sash of rainbow wool for a belt, did nothing to counter the impression of a figure heaved painfully and against steep odds into the present, out of the rank and degraded past. Miriam's own outfit, once her coat was at last loosened, struck Cicero as a kind of costume rather than ingenuous clothing. A yellow silk-screened Groucho Marx t-shirt, worn braless beneath her white denim jacket, peace sign earrings, and tiny purple-tinted John Lennon shades. Cicero sometimes wondered, were hippies serious? Anyway, cousin Lenny clocked her nipples like a hypnotist's pocket watch, a distraction that ought to provide Cicero with an advantage in the coming chess match. Really, though, cousin? A horny, tragic uncle, that's what Cicero thought now, as he stood with his fists dug into the pocket of his Tom Seaver Mets warm-up jacket, staring. Rose had implied Lenny was Miriam's contemporary, but he seemed 20 years older, at least. Lenny still hadn't glanced at Cicero, so far as Cicero could tell. When he did, Cicero felt caught, lulled into making a move, as though Lenin Anguish had only been a movie projected on a screen, not a person who could look back. "So why," said cousin Lenny, "why did no one mention that the Black Fisher was a man mountain?" Cicero was, at 13, already accustomed to being presented by Rose to those who'd shamelessly exclaim over him. There were only so many things they could exclaim. He was ready for Man Mountain, ready for Black. He picked out only what interested him. "You really had a match with Fisher?" he asked cousin Lenny. "One game, a draw." Lenny's boiling eyes consulted Miriam's. "You told him?" "I'm sure you can imagine that it was Rose who mentioned Fisher," said Miriam. "I'll let you explain it." "Under a tented canopy," Lenny began. "Fisher against 20 at once. Opponents seated, him stalking among us, glancing at the boards, selecting his moves carelessly, like a man brushing ants from a picnic table. That's how the captured pieces flew. He savaged us. I think he forgot a pawn on my board. Maybe something got stuck in his eye. Who knows? It was a windy day. I was the last alive, my position tenable. Yet when he turned full attention to me, I deposited a small portion of diarrhea into my pants. I offered a draw, and he took it. Who knows? Maybe in his contract it said he shouldn't have humiliated every last man, but rather leave one figure of identification for the common rabble to root for. Maybe he just wanted to be done with it. Maybe he wanted a sandwich. In any event, I and my shitted Fruit of the Looms recorded a drawn match against Bobby Fischer, Coney Island, May 1964. The room full of players deferred to Lenny. Whether out of respect or wearied aggravation, you couldn't say. A table was cleared by the window overlooking McDougal Street, the glass of tea placed in Lenny's hands. "Play white," he commanded Cicero, seating himself at the black pieces. "He doesn't need to be indulged," said Miriam. "I'm not indulging, believe me," said Lenny. "I want to see his attacking game. If he doesn't have one, he's nowhere. I can see by his outfit he's a front runner. He likes winners, so let him show me he knows how to win." I have to explain this. In 1969, the Mets actually won the World Series. It will happen in our lifetimes again, like the revolution. "If you want to understand my cousin Lenny," Miriam explained, "begin with the fact that he's the one human occupant of Queens who couldn't allow himself to enjoy the miracle Mets." "Ha!" said Lenny. "The Mets are the opiate of the masses. Make her tell you, kid. Make her tell you how your team represents the abortion of socialist baseball in America." Lenny knew Bill Shea, Miriam explained. Shea, like the stadium, the guy who brought the Mets. Lenny had another idea. "Never speak that running dog's name aloud," said Lenny. "Have her tell you, when I'm out of hearing distance, the death of the Sunnyside proletarians." It's a team that Lenny has proposed. "The death of the Sunnyside proletarians. Your team's a crime scene, kid. No hard feelings." "Play chess," said Miriam, "unless you're afraid of him." "He's playing white, Mim. I await the Wunderkind's debut." Miriam stole one of the bentwood chairs from another table and placed herself beside Cicero, as if she'd be playing for his side. Cicero pushed King's pawn. He needed to pee, said nothing. Lenny, grunting, unhooked a forefinger from his ear long enough to shove a pawn to mirror Cicero's. Then out flopped knights. Cicero centered himself within this veil of discomfort and disgust on the possible actions of the pieces, while the large second-story window steamed with pipe smoke exhalations, burps, and farts. Miriam, not watching the board, waved at the street below, apparently someone she knew, a musician kicking along with a giant case containing either an upright bass or $1 million worth of hashish. Outside, the world had colors. Outside, the world had colors and likely sounds other than the lung rattle of opponents not yet informed of their deaths at some earlier date, possibly in the late 1950s. The interior of the chess shop, apart from Cousin Lenny's improbable sash, was in black and white. Outside 1970 was more than a possibility. It was a likelihood just weeks away. In here, rumors of Sputnik might still have been rash. The present was a gelled substance, like hair pomade, bottled behind this glass. Cicero couldn't navigate it with his knights. In fact, Cousin Lenny now shocked him by trapping one and removing it from the board. "You're going to lose this game," said Lenny. "You like coins, kid?" "I never thought about them," said Cicero. "You should discover coins. Numismatics presents a world of fascination and value, because frankly, this is going nowhere for you." "Play the game, Lenny," said Miriam. "I can talk and play," said Lenny, "especially play your protege here. He's got no attack to speak of." "You know this after 6 moves?" "You're not even watching, Miriam. We've played 16. I've seen enough. You're a civilian, so you want to see bloodshed. If you demand that I checkmate him, I'll do it for you, but the kid's smart enough to resign already." Cicero glanced at Miriam, then back at the board. If he didn't study Lenny's decrepitude, only listened to them flicking insults, he could believe they were cousins. Lenny paid as little attention as Miriam. Cicero was left alone to study the position of the pieces, unless you counted the steady gaze, amused and skeptical, of Groucho Marx from Miriam's t-shirt. Cicero thought he still had a prayer. He noticed a seam of vulnerability for his surviving knight to explore. But advancing the knight in this cause, he felt an instantaneous knowledge, spreading like a blush of shame across his whole front, that Lenny had been waiting for him to overreach this last and fatal time. No sooner had the piece landed than Lenny's hand flicked out to push the bishop's pawn a square forward, inflicting on Cicero's ranks 3 simultaneous disasters. They both knew it. The question was who'd inform Miriam. "Likely you have a terrific defensive game," said Cousin Lenny. His red, hoary fingertips and weird, nubby thumbs scrabbled at remote outposts in his beard. "You flop the pieces from side to side, letting an adversary defeat himself. Playing impatient 13-year-olds, this is a good strategy. You prefer black, don't you? I spotted this when I first laid eyes on you. Incredibly, Cousin Lenny seemed to include no innuendo or shame in this remark, but meant it as a cold statement of fact. It was one. Cicero preferred black. He nodded. Of course you do, said Lenny. As it happens, this is how I stayed in against Fisher. I circled my wagons. I bored him to death. You think you've been playing chess, but you've been playing your opponents, kid, not the pieces. Miriam, this child is a prodigious listener, a watcher of his fellow human animals. I'd be terrified of what information he's gathered on you to this point, as I'm already terrified of him myself. If we can ascertain his sympathies, he may prove highly useful to the cause of the workers' revolution, but he'll go nowhere in chess. Now, Mim, tell me, when are you leaving your Goyish singer so that we can commence the life for which we were intended? He must be losing his looks by now, and in this I have the advantage, having had no looks to begin with. The day you quit jerking off, Lenny, is the day I leave him, said Miriam. You know I've always promised this, but remember I can see into your bedroom. Lenny put his hands over the Woodstock bird and his own heart. Then he cupped the fingers of his right hand, placed them lower down, and shook them as if they held a pair of dice. You who've robbed me of my heart's desire since the day you sprouted a bosom, you'll take even this from me? Discipline, Lenny. He shrugged, arched his fuller brushes, beckoned heaven with an upraised palm, evoking the full worldliness of a Yiddish stageham's rendition of Hamlet or Oedipus. Then I'll have to jerk in the foyer where you can't see me. Miriam flipped him the bird. We've got a date with an astrologer, Lenny. I'll see you another time. Wait! With the same hand that had phantom jerked, Lenny now horrifyingly dug in his pants pocket. Here, he pressed something cool into Cicero's hand, a zinc U.S. penny. Rose's almighty Lincoln, rendered in tinfoil. Cousin Lenny lowered his voice. Study that coin. If you persist, you'll find in it the whole secret law of history. The death of the United States of America rests there in your hand, kid. You can listen to it whisper if you hold your head close. I need to use the restroom, said Cicero. Miriam took Cicero downstairs to the toilet and then out of the chess shop, that library of souls, that grave of time, onto the sidewalks of Greenwich Village, where 1969 was permitted to reassert itself, resume its animation and flow. Though 1969 was as much a confabulation, surely, as that thickened portion of time trapped behind the chess mezzanine's window. The present, nevertheless, had the advantage of being still open to negotiation. Cicero had heard that all sorts of people lived in Greenwich Village. The 13-year-old secret faggot was ready to meet them. Miriam said, I hope you weren't scandalized by that jackass. Cicero said nothing. Did scandalize include how, in the chess shop's tragic, minuscule restroom, his dick was surprisingly hard before he drained it? Crummy, scummy Cousin Lenny? Could Lenny have been a subject for Cicero's fixations? Maybe it was just the matter-of-fact mimicry Lenny had performed with his hand. Maybe it was the way he'd wrenched Cicero from his hiding place of chess, reinstalling him in the perplexity of the adult world. He'll go nowhere in chess. That was the phrase Lenin Angrish used, in an action with a result as sudden as pressing a James Bond ejection seat button. Cicero knew plenty of nowhere. On Queens Boulevard, on Skillman or Jackson or Greenpoint Avenues, in Rose's company or surrounded by streaming schoolchildren, or alone, which added up to the same thing. Nowhere, nothing, no how. Cicero was still at home only in himself. There, barely. To Lenny's verdict, Cicero now added a vow. Black pieces or white, he'd never touch chessmen again. He fingered the zinc penny deep in his pocket. American money was a lie. The Mets, a crime scene. Lenny thrilled Cicero by his allusions to secret knowledge, history as a drama of lies. Perhaps it was this that had bestowed Cicero's hard-on. Okay, I'll stop there.